Hello, fifth graders. Last week we read pages 7 through 13 in We're Writing the Constitution by Jean Fritz. Today we're going to read pages 14 through 29. So, page 14. If the people of the country were afraid what might happen in the convention, so were the delegates themselves. They didn't call the document they were working on a constitution. They referred to it as the plan, because they knew that the country was sensitive to the word national. They tried to stick to federal, a word they were used to, and one which didn't reduce the power of the states. But after Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia, had presented what he came to be called the Virginia Plan, he spoke right out. In the Virginia Plan, Randolph explained, there would be 3 branches of government. The executive branch would have a head who would be responsible for running the government. The legislative branch would be made up of 2 houses, which would make laws. The House of Representatives would be elected directly by the people. The Senate, the smaller and supposedly more cool-headed body, would be elected by the House. Together, they would be called the Congress. The 3rd branch would be the judiciary, headed by a Supreme Court, which would make sure that laws were constitutional and were properly obeyed. Here is a picture or a diagram of the Virginia Plan for the government. Page 16. Edmund Randolph was a tall, handsome, likable man, and nothing he said at first seemed alarming. Some of the states had constitutions that were similar to the one he described. Besides, the members knew that after Randolph's plan had been discussed, other members would have a chance to present their plans. But at the end of his speech, Randolph did arouse his audience. It should be clear, he said, that his resolutions were not merely for a federal government, but for a national government that would be supreme over the states. There was a dead silence. Page 17. Pierce Butler of South Carolina was one of the first to recover. He jumped down hard on the word national, but John Dickinson of Delaware said there was nothing wrong with the word. We are a nation, he declared. No, for Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts, this kind of talk was scary. He was a thin, worrying sort of man who was sometimes called Grumbletonian behind his back. National? He sputtered. How could they think national? They had been sent here to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to destroy them. Page 18. As the meetings went on, all kinds of fear surfaced. The smaller states with fewer people were afraid of the larger states, which had more people. In the past, the votes of all states, no matter what their population, had counted the same. But a national government would be more concerned with individual people than with the states themselves. So, what would happen to the small states now? And what kind of government were they forming? Some people were afraid of a high-toned or aristocratic government run by a small, privileged, wealthy group, the way a monarchy was usually run. Others were just as afraid of the common people having too much power. They weren't capable of governing, it was said. Eventually, the convention did agree on a national legislature to consist of 2 houses, but before final acceptance, the word national was crossed out. Still, there were so many questions to decide. What about the person who was to be the executive or head of the government? Should there be just one person? If so, would he seem like a king? Why not 3 people, each representing a different part of the country? But what if they fought among themselves? What if they couldn't reach an agreement? Should the executive be paid a salary? Yes, said Madison. Don't count on patriotism. But who should pay the salary? The states or the government of the United States? How should the executive be chosen? By the people? By the states? By a branch of the United States legislature? By electors? By lot? They had to vote 60 times before they could settle this question. And how long should the executive serve? Page 19. If he were thought to be guilty of misconduct, could they impeach him? Could they remove him from office? Alexander Hamilton was one of the few who wanted the president to serve a long term, perhaps even for life. He thought it would be embarrassing to watch a lot of ex-presidents wandering around like ghosts. But suppose you had a long-term president, Franklin pointed out, and suppose he turned out to be a bad president. What then? Out of simple kindness, they ought to provide some way to get rid of him. Otherwise, Franklin chuckled, the only thing they could do would be to shoot him. Page 20. In the end, it was decided that there should be a single executive who would be paid out of the treasury of the new government. He would be chosen by electors from each state, and he would serve 4 years. And yes, if it was necessary, he could be impeached. But what if he should die while in office, or be impeached? Who would take his place? So there had to be a vice president, the one who came in second in the presidential election. And since the vice president should do more than just wait around to see if the president would make it through his term, he was given the job of presiding over the Senate. Mr. Randolph finished presenting his plan on May 29th, and for the next 2 weeks, until June 13th, the convention went over it. Some measures were voted on, some would be revised, and all would be discussed again and again. But there was also the chance that the whole plan would be scrapped for something else. After a day's recess, on June 15th, William Patterson of New Jersey stood up. Only 5'2". He wasn't as impressive as a figure as Mr. Randolph, but he was a cheerful, modest, likable man. Still, he didn't approve of a single idea of Mr. Randolph's. The government should be a federation of states as it was now, with each state having an equal vote, he said. It should consist of one legislative body with several executives at its head. According to Mr. Patterson, the Virginia plan was impractical, illegal, and expensive. How could so many members of Congress, he asked, find the money to travel from all over the country to attend meetings? Page 21. When James Madison answered Mr. Patterson, it was as if he were fencing. Madison danced all around Mr. Patterson's arguments, thrusting at first one point and then another, until it seemed as if there was nothing left of William Patterson's plan. And there wasn't. When the delegates were asked to vote in favor of one of the two plans, Mr. Randolph's won, 7 states against 3. Maryland's delegation was divided. Randolph's plan still had to be thrashed out, but the idea of a federation was dead. With this vote, the delegates committed themselves to write a constitution for a new nation, whether all of them were willing to call it that or not. Page 22. But so much work lay ahead. They would be at it all summer, the delegates said, and some sent for their families to join them. John Dickinson of Delaware spent much of his free time writing to his 4-year-old daughter, Maria, whom he always addressed as Pa's Precious. Rufus King of Massachusetts and Luther Martin of Maryland went to the library and took out books but never returned them. Sorry, they said when asked about it. Their servants must have failed to deliver them. Sorry or not, however, they had to pay for the books. Page 23. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut had the most interesting news to write home. He had shaken the hand of a woman who was 2,000 years old, he said. An Egyptian mummy was on display in the Philadelphia, but Oliver wasn't content just to look. He wondered what the flesh was like, so he took out his knife and tested it. Like old smoked beef, he reported. Page 24. Meanwhile, the people in Philadelphia did their best to keep the delegates happy. They entertained them, provided musicals, and so that they could work in peace and quiet, they covered the cobblestone street in front of the State House with gravel. Now carriages made less noise when they rolled past. But there were some things Philadelphians couldn't change. The heat, for instance. It was a blistering summer, especially for the delegates from New England, who, not used to such heat, sweated out the summer in woolen suits. And there were blue bottle flies. Philadelphia was bombarded by these huge, buzzing flies. They flung themselves at the windows of the State House, attacked delegates when they stepped outside, and invaded bedrooms, buzzing all night in such a frenzy they sounded insane. Page 25. Nor could Philadelphia do anything about the prison which stood in front of the State House yard. It was a 4-story building, and as soon as the delegates came into the yard, prisoners crowded against their windows and pushed long, begging poles through the iron bars. Attached to the end of each pole was a cloth cap for collecting money. The prisoners would dangle the poles, wiggle them, and cry out to be noticed. And if the delegates were not generous enough, and how could they be generous enough every day, the prisoners would jeer and call the delegates nasty names. Page 26. It couldn't have been any fun to sit all day in a stuffy room, arguing, and then be insulted as soon as they stepped out for a breath of fresh air. On the other hand, the delegates may have had too much on their minds to pay attention. Certainly they suffered in many ways, and it was a wonder they didn't quit. Some did. 2 delegates from New York, who didn't like the way the convention was going, went home. But most knew that they were deciding the future of their country, one which would be larger and different from anything they could imagine now. Sometimes when a delegate worried that the people wouldn't like this or the people wouldn't like that, James Madison became impatient. He knew what the people would like, he asked. Their job was to make the best possible government, not simply please the people. And all the time George Washington sat in front of them, his expression stern as if he were saying, now or never. It would be hard to walk out on Washington. Yet it was sometimes hard to stay, especially when Luther Martin of Maryland took the floor. He was a tall, mushed-up-looking man who loved the sound of his own voice so much that once he started talking, he couldn't bear to stop. He talked loudly and passionately. He repeated himself and indeed was so boring that Madison didn't bother to write it all down. And Benjamin Franklin went to sleep. Page 28. But as the convention droned on and on, the delegates worried. Was it possible for them ever to agree on a constitution? The biggest stumbling block was the question of how power should be divided in the government. Should the states be represented in Congress according to the population of each state? Yes, said the large states with large populations. No, the small states with small populations said. Madison tried to point out that the large states would have no reason to gang up on the smaller states. The large states had so little in common, they would probably end up, he said, as rivals, not friends. But the small states were not convinced. At one point, the tension was so great that Franklin suggested they ask a minister to start them off every day with a prayer. But they couldn't even agree on this. A delegate from North Carolina pointed out that there wasn't enough money to pay a minister. Hamilton said that the appearance of a minister would start rumors. People would say that if the convention was suddenly in need of prayer, it must be in deep trouble. In particular, the small states wanted to know if they would have an equal vote in the Senate. The delegates could not reach a decision. When they took a vote, it came out a tie, 5 yes, 5 no, with Georgia's delegates divided. The small states became so bitter that once they threatened to break off from the rest of the country and make their own treaties with foreign nations. This was the lowest point of the whole summer. The convention was held together now, Luther Martin said, by no more than the strength of a hair. Washington, not easily discouraged, admitted that he almost despaired, and indeed, his feelings must have shown on his face. He had his Valley Forge look, people said. Perhaps the weather, page 29, perhaps the weather helped to break the stalemate. The month-long heat wave broke over the weekend of July 14th and 15th, and by Monday, July 16th, the delegates seemed to recognize how urgent it was to find a way to agree. And they did. They called it the Great Compromise. Every state would have 2 members in the Senate with equal votes, while the House of Representatives would have 1 representative for every 40,000 inhabitants. Later, this was changed to read not to exceed 1 for every 30,000. This is where we're going to stop for today. See your activities on the agenda to go along with these pages. Refer back to this video to help you with those activities. See you next week.